Going into Slake's Limbo by Felice Holman, I found it dark, gloomy, and filled with symbolic language. There are many things I've noticed about it. For starters, the way Holman wrote her main character, Aramis Slake, implies she didn't exactly have high hopes for him. At first, anyway. Examples include describing him as useless to gangs, a clumsy thief due to poor vision, and claiming that anyone could beat him for any reason or non-reason. Holman also offered many details about the setting, which reminds me a little of Theodore Taylor's writing in The K, aside from the fact that both stories are about survival. For example, she describes Slake's neighborhood as containing boarded-up buildings, lots filled with junk, and scrawled walls that announce names, called obscenities. A staple of the book is Slake's subway adventure and what it's like to be in motion as the train clatters and sways its way downtown. However, there are quite a few differences between these two novels. For one, this book takes place in 1970s America, while The K took place during the Second World War in 1942. So, the circumstances and socioeconomic and cultural contexts won't necessarily be comparable or immediately encourage a connection. Even more blatant is the setup of each book respectively. The K takes place on a deserted island in the Caribbean, and Slake's Limbo takes place in an underground subway where Slake hides out in. I will say this, however. Despite natural disasters being more likely to strike the K, Timothy and Philip's situation seems more preferable to me because the environment at least guarantees free food, like fruits, fish, and fresh rainwater, and resources for camps, fires, and other tools that could help fight against attacks and disasters. What's more, Philip had Timothy to teach him survival skills, like building, hunting, and gathering. For the majority of the book, the pair was also able to work together, so Philip, in spite of his blindness, had an advantage over Slake. That's because Slake is mostly on his own, with a low-income job, and is an easy target for shady, intimidating characters. He's unable to own or build property anywhere, and food is actually quite difficult to come by. Included in the book are these on another track chapters. At first, I wondered how they would relate to what is happening with Slake. Would the character in these extra chapters, named Willis Joe Winnie, meet Slake at some point in the novel? I predicted that they would cross paths at some point, mandating the start of a new mystery that I was anxious to read about. I discovered a symbol on page 7 of the first chapter in my edition. Holman describes Slake as having a bird in his stomach. Now, this doesn't mean he's literally housing a bird in his stomach. Rather, it's an expression that could be indicating his vulnerability, like hunger, improper care, weakness from beatings, that sort of thing. I imagine there would be many more symbols like this that color the characters' plights that much more. As with the K, I was able to picture the book's events in my mind through Holman's masterful accounts of Slake's point of view, his feelings, his surroundings, and his motivations. The latter also applies to other characters. Things didn't seem to be looking good for Slake, but I had hoped he'd find his way soon. As I progressed through the story, I was able to draw comparisons between Slake's new life in the subway and his past life with his aunt in her apartment by his discernment. By choosing to live independently, he meets friendly people, besides his best friend, who offer him jobs to pay for food and other support he needs. Whereas before, his aunt never gave him anything, and he was almost always alone, susceptible to beatings. As for the on another track chapters, I was beginning to learn more about Willis Joe Winnie. He seems to be a pretty decent man with a job in the subway as a conductor. He first started out as a sweeper, mostly working in a garage. His years of hard work with less income clearly paid off. His current goal is to raise enough money for a trip to Australia. He enjoys jogging in his free time and is married with 2 children. All appears normal, which made my anticipation all the more tantalizing. I believe that I discovered yet another symbol in chapter 5 on page 45. There are messages on the wall in the subway, each one being a statement almost always accompanied by a reply. At first, I wondered about their significance when Slake decided to write something as well. I immediately realized he wants to be found by someone and to ask for loans, and these messages set up that opportunity to cry for help, so to speak. The messages themselves, however, seem so odd. Holman spent the next few chapters detailing Slake's new life, sticking to a daily routine delivering newspapers, making enough money to eat normally, and making new allies during his exploration of the underground life. At this point, the novel sparked a lot of questions for me. Would Slake's aunt ever find him? Would Slake ever find a new home, or at least some support? Would I discover more symbols and mysteries, including any that involve Willis Joe Whitney in the On Another Track chapters? I predicted that Slake would experience struggles and would have to look for greater assistance. I noticed that Slake and Philip in the K are both useless and defenseless at first, but later make themselves useful. Philip's case is more understandable since he became blind and needed Timothy to teach him survival skills, though he nonetheless learns to trust Timothy and rely on his instincts to pull through. Slake was helpless at first, but takes control of the situation by actively seeking out opportunities and taking risks. I had a feeling things were about to get quite suspenseful going forward. Having completed the novel, it ended more or less the way I expected it to. I thought the On Another Track chapters were odd at first, because of their apparent lack of relevance to the main story. But I knew Slake and Willis Joe Whitney would meet eventually, and that indeed happened. Just not in the way I imagined it would. Slake became delirious at one point and wasn't sure of his own whereabouts. Willis Joe Whitney showed up to rescue Slake just as he was about to walk in front of an oncoming train. Slake had collapsed, so he never actually realized someone rescued him and checked him into a hospital until after he woke up to flowers in his room. He knew someone out there cared enough to save his life. I'm glad he never had to deal with his aunt again, though I somehow knew that would be the case. My favorite quote is, "Slake did not know exactly where he was going, but the general direction was up," indicating that he'll finally leave the subway to see what else is out there and live for the first time in his life. It's crazy to think how such a stressful event could actually lead to a positive change in someone's life, and that's precisely what happened to Slake. The book really was quite bleak, but this one shocking turn that could have otherwise ended horribly, to be frank, brought him out of an uncertain limbo. In spite of slight improvements to his situation here and there, he ultimately wasn't going anywhere. As morbid as this sounds, his near-death experience pretty much had to happen in order for him to get out of that mindset and move on. That sort of thing happens in real life all the time. I was thoroughly impressed by the use of symbolic language in this story. That aspect of it reminds me a great deal of Zed for Zachariah by Robert C. O'Brien. In it, the crab tree symbolizes marriage, but the apples falling out of the tree warns that marriage may not be possible, or really even a good idea at this time. The little bird flying skyward signifies a message for heaven, but when it fell out of a tree, it seemed to suggest a message for Earth instead, possibly a warning to Anne about her near future. So much suspense. Though Slake's Limbo isn't necessarily one of my favorite novels, I'd still recommend it to a friend, because it teaches youth about the unfortunate realities of what many young people could be going through that we don't notice or care to notice. Those of us who are fortunate should definitely be grateful for what we have or can have. We tend to dismiss those in need as nothing more than creepers because of how they look and behave, not realizing that factors like malnutrition and trauma could be playing a part in that. It's so important to be mindful and at least be able to point the less fortunate in the direction that might be helpful to their individual cases. The book also warns us to not feel as though we are trapped in a routine that seems to be working out for us in the moment, to the point where it can have detrimental consequences for our health and overall well-being, like it almost did for Slake.